Great. And now our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen and Scotan peoples on whose traditional territory we work and play, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Masonic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. A few words about what's happening now. The Victoria Natural History Society, formed in 1944. The longevity of this organization is something to be very proud of. And from the NHS, now known as Nature Victoria, we have HAT, the Habitat Acquisition Trust, and Rocky Point Bird Observatory. Both were offshoots of VNHS original organizers, so we're really delighted that they've had such an impact in our community. To become a member, if you are not already, please visit the website. There's different opportunities there. Membership categories are as indicated here. There are also on the website is an opportunity to connect with us if you have some questions about that. Upcoming events, I'll just draw your attention to Birders Night this month. Dr. Willow English will be presenting on window strikes. She works very closely with solutions and has a lot to offer us to help protect birds here. And Marine Night this month is West Coast Plankton. So the VNHS calendar is available on the site for you to register for these events. And now, without further ado, please welcome Patty. And Patty, I will stop sharing so that you can take over, and thank you for what you're about to share.
Thanks very much, Elia. I'll just, I hope that's there. Can everyone see that?
Yes, I see your main slide and your slides to the left.
Great.
There you go.
Thanks
Perfect.
very much. Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for joining. For today's presentation, I'll be reviewing nature-based solutions for urban areas and why it's important to Greater Victoria, new global and local standards for urban planning, case studies from around the world, and how we can all provide input into local community plans that affect nature in our area. So this information is based on a global consensus by hundreds of organizations, some of which you see here, like the UN, G20, BC and Canadian governments, C40 cities, UBCM, Natural Assets Initiative and Stewardship Centre for BC. And I started this project as part of the UVic Climate Action Planning Program with Dr. Kara Shaw, and have continued with it in my community work during the rest of 2024. So organizations like the UN and G20 are saying that nature-based solutions for cities must now be a priority because we're moving past 1.5 degree global warming targets, and cities suffer the most with impermeable surfaces, which cause dangerous urban heat islands and flash flooding, killing people and costing billions of dollars. And we must integrate housing with a critical mass of private and public green space. And to quote the G20 and UN, they say, you can see on the screen, awareness of the potential for nature-based solutions to enhance life in cities needs to shift at every level, from civil servants and planning departments to individual developers to citizens choosing the priorities for their own city. Involving environmental experts in the planning and design of urban areas has become essential. So what are nature-based solutions? They're natural and urban ecosystems integrated and planned together with built infrastructure from the start of every project. They reduce emissions by 17% on average, according to studies from the EU, because they encourage more walking and biking and less driving, because people will have a tendency to stay near home to enjoy nature as opposed to driving long distances. And of course, they sequester carbon. And they save money by reducing climate change impacts of extreme heat, flooding, drought, and biodiversity loss. And natural asset management is one component that I'll talk about later. And as the UN says, nature-based infrastructure is the only way countries can achieve progress on sustainable development goals, global biodiversity framework, and the Paris Agreement at the same time. So here's an example from the district of North Vancouver of a nature-based infrastructure diagram. District of North Van has done a lot of work in this area. And there's a question, where are these photos from? This is a depiction from MIT of nature-based solutions in an urban area. And this bottom photo is from Shutterstock James Stewart. So I'm not sure what area that is, what city that is. So this nature-based infrastructure diagram, you can see on the left, pristine wilderness, and on the right is an urban center. And in the past, the focus was on managing nature on the left in pristine areas or environmentally sensitive areas, but this has just made our urban heat islands, flooding, and biodiversity crisis worse. So here, the District of North Van has classified their full spectrum of natural, semi-natural, and enhanced urban assets into categories like wetlands, pollinator gardens, urban trees, bioswales, and permeable pavers. And these assets cannot succeed without wildlife like birds, insects, and mammals, because they distribute pollen and fertilize the soil. And in turn, wildlife depends on interconnected green corridors to biodiverse hotspots with several layers of vegetation along those corridors to survive, like trees, shrubs, and ground covers. So there's recognition that when this full cycle of ecosystem services is supported, we can benefit from clean air and water, reduce physical and mental health care costs, reduce burdens on emergency services, stormwater systems, and BC hydro infrastructure, and it protects our tourism-based economy, which depends on outdoor recreation and wildlife. And nature-based solutions are especially important for the CRD because we live in the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone with Garry Oak and arbutus habitat, found nowhere else in Canada. And as you can see in the top left, the dark green areas are the actual CDF zone, and the light green areas are that buffer zone of dry Western hemlock. And the rest of Vancouver Island is coastal Western hemlock, so a different environment and vegetation. So CDF zone is the smallest, most endangered ecozone in BC, a tiny sliver around the Salish Sea. And our zone is already urbanized with 75% of BC's population and only 1% old growth forest left. There aren't any remote CDF forests that we can protect. So we have no choice but to integrate nature into urbanized areas. And with 80% of land private and 30 to 40% canopy targets, we need vegetation on private urban lots, not just public spaces. So, for example, Western bluebirds that you see pictured here were extirpated from the island in 1995. And the Cowichan Bring Back the Bluebirds project is translocating birds from the US. So hopefully we can reestablish them on the island. And to recognize this area's natural and cultural significance, there's a proposal to have the CRD designated as the UNESCO Urban Biosphere Region. And this proposal has been organized by Martin Sager of UNESCO World Heritage Project and the Greater Victoria Naturehood Committee led by Bob Peart, Rick Searle, and Jacques Sirois. And the organizing committee received permission from the Lekwungen community to name this region Kamasung, because Victoria was originally known as Kamasung after a Lekwungen girl on the Gorge, whose story teaches us about the importance of place and the importance of looking after nature. And there's a sacred place on the gorge where people could go if they lost their spirit. and they could ask the creator to give it back. And this place is now marked by the statue of Kamasung in Gorge Waterway Park. So in August, an event was hosted by the BC Lieutenant Governor, Janet Austin, to pass the resolution to nominate the CRD as an urban biosphere region. And that's defined as an important urban area where natural, socioeconomic, and cultural environments are shaped by urban influences and pressures and managed for the conservation of biological and cultural diversity, social and economic sustainability, support for research and education, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and support for reconciliation. And this is all related to the sustainability and biodiversity that's mentioned in government documents. BC itself has committed to low carbon resilience and climate adaptation strategies that include attention to the natural environment and nature-based solutions specifically. And as Colwood has described, nature-based solutions include natural asset management, which we'll talk about later, and official community plan objectives for climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity supports. So how can we ensure that governments follow through with all these commitments? A report by the Natural Assets Initiative for the BC Ministry of Municipal Affairs said that OCPs tend to focus on facilitating property development and regional growth strategies that establish greenhouse gas targets without any connection to nature. And it goes on to say BC must protect nature and its services in the Local Government Act and Community Charter. And more attention needs to be paid to building practices, watersheds, riparian areas, private forest, wildlife, health and heritage. The report also says there's a lack of sense of urgency among policymakers. This report was submitted in 2023. And also a lack of supportive policy and legal frameworks, and a lack of skilled knowledge brokers for information translation and training programs. Is it possible to implement all these things? And we can say yes, because New York City has done it. They've integrated nature into urban areas. And one recent example was from Rebecca McMacken, an ecological horticulturalist that also has a TED Talk you can watch on YouTube. And she worked with New York City and Brooklyn Bridge Park to convert old shipping piers into natural habitat with native plants. So this is the transformation. And those park areas now support complete wildlife life cycles in the heart of New York City. And even as they were planting some plants, there were butterflies descending onto the plants, eager to access all the goodies. So we can do something similar if New York can do that. What's happening currently in this area? So recently, the government of BC announced new housing legislation, and it's not connected to Canadian or BC climate and sustainable development plans. It's defined, or the legislation and the bills are defined by built infrastructure experts only, and public input is now prohibited if developments meet the requirements of zoning bylaws. But OCPs are available, official community plans are available to drive community objectives for these developments. And we'll get into more detail about how that can happen. So in September 2024, the Union of BC Municipalities responded to these housing bills with resolutions NR 23 and NR 73 by asking BC, and in their words, to revise Housing Bills 44 and 47 to embed requirements for tree canopy expansion, climate resilience, enhanced stormwater management, all related to heat island effects, impermeable surfaces, and loss of green space that may result without the ability to enforce these requirements. So quoting those resolutions, they say public education, outreach, and environmental protection legislation, bylaws, and regulations have not been successful in protecting our streams and environment, and current resources available to municipalities will prove inadequate to ensure protection of these fragile resources. So they're asking the province to do that. And if we look here, their concerns are evident in some local developments. If you look at the one on the left in Toronto, it's considered climate resilient because it's been designed to incorporate setbacks for trees and shrubs and nature-based solutions to provide all the benefits we've been talking about. Developments like the one on the right can be 12 to 15 degrees hotter in summer and colder in winter due to wind exposure and exposed to flooding and pollution, more so than the one on the left, which increases health, stormwater, energy, and emergency costs for both local governments and residents. And another example, neighborhoods like these in Langford have been shown to be 12 degrees hotter than treed areas, and this increases energy use for air conditioning, which is a problem because BC Hydro is being affected by increasing drought, and they're now looking at alternative clean energy like solar and wind power as well to help with these issues. And you know, the lack of trees and lack of vegetation also causes families with kids to drive more, increasing carbon emissions because they have no green space. Impermeable surfaces are also causing flash floods and contaminating streams with urban pollution everywhere, like we saw in Toronto this summer. And Catherine Backhouse from the University of Waterloo specifically referenced these issues. She said, we're removing things such as natural infrastructure and replacing it with cement. And the CRD itself said one of the most pressing issues in CRD watersheds is the effect of urbanization. And you can see a conceptual diagram of how they're proposing developers' guides for watershed-wise development in the top right, and the use of nature-based solutions. Also, BC's housing guidance for 2-meter setbacks don't allow room for trees. If you compare it to what climate adaptation guidance says, trees need around 5 to 6 meters of space. And this also happens to be the length of a car. So there's a way to create a win-win situation where there's room to fit some parking as well as trees, shrubs, and ground covers with enough setbacks to achieve our clean air objectives, as well as reduce heat and rainfall stress and need for biodiversity. And we also need to require permeable surfaces and permeable pavers to help with stormwater management. And this is shown in a diagram from Australia that shows a multi-unit housing development with the same concepts of natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions to provide clean air and water and physical, mental health and safety from extreme weather, and the ability to support wildlife life cycles. And cities like Toronto and Brooklyn, New York, and the C40 Cities group are requiring and specifying more soil, shrubs, and trees, because if we want homes for people instead of investors, then safety and livability need to be part of the equation. And they save cities money in water, electrical, and stormwater systems, protect people from heat and flooding, and they improve walking and biking routes and reduce emissions. Guelph and Singapore also continue to prioritize nature-based solutions. with enough rooms around housing development for trees and vegetation. Vancouver's green infrastructure diagrams also show this need to provide buffers between noisy, polluted areas and homes for residents, and the need for 3 layers of ecosystem services like trees, shrubs, and ground covers, as well as bioswales for pollution filtration. And this diagram is from the draft OCP in Victoria, showing what the downtown core and areas right around the downtown core could look like with green spaces filling blocks of multi-unit buildings. And this is a way that 30 to 40% green infrastructure can be achieved. So what can we do to ensure that nature is incorporated into our city's plans and processes? Important thing is that we need to provide feedback through letters or public participation or surveys, community associations, getting together and providing a group letter always help. And in the past, if you look at some of the proposals, the focus has been on technologies like air conditioning and cooling centers and water parks. But the issue with these types of solutions that are called climate adaptation is that they result in higher electricity and water use, which is the opposite of what we want. So we want to remind councils and staff of the work that's already been done in other cities and other organizations. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we need to point out the significance of our areas and the special ecosystems that we're surrounded by and that need to be integrated in the cities. So we need to point out nature-based solutions for both climate mitigation and adaptation, provide links to commitments that BC and the CRD have already made for nature-based solutions and climate and watershed and biodiversity plans. We can point to examples from Colwood and other cities and organizations around the world. And until October 11th, City of Victoria happens to have a sustainability engagement and a request for feedback. So you can provide input through the email address or the website survey. And then Colwood, we won't get into this in a lot of detail, but Colwood has an amazing amount of information related to its biodiversity and nature-based solutions plans. So I encourage you to look at those because they identify the departments that are leading the initiatives, the supporting departments, and the timelines that they've set for themselves. And they also talk about community climate objectives and environmental co-benefits, social co-benefits, and economic co-benefits. So there's a lot we can borrow from Colwood in other municipalities. And another thing we can do is ask municipalities to report on their natural asset management programs, and those place economic value on natural and urban assets. And this has already started in some municipalities. Colwood and Saanich are at the forefront. Colwood actually was the first to have a natural asset inventory, and they have strategies on the table to achieve it. View Royal is now taking a natural asset management roadmap program, NAM roadmap program, and CRD Victoria and Esquimalt have completed a NAT workshop. Victoria is starting on a natural asset inventory, and Esquimalt is planning for the same. And Central and North Saanich have already committed to frameworks within the OCP. So again, this is a complex diagram, but what it shows from Saanich is that natural asset management is core to all their strategies and all their outputs. And it interfaces with their official community plan, their traditional asset management strategy that traditionally incorporates engineered assets, their biodiversity conservation strategy, climate plan, integrated stormwater management plan, urban forest strategy. And on the right, it affects the financial plan and development permit areas and bylaws. So let's get into a definition of what natural asset management is. It's like an accounting tool for nature-based solutions that for local governments, and it's for all departments, not only parks or urban forestry. All departments would use it, like planning, engineering, parks, emergency, and finance. It uses cost-benefit analysis tools for natural and enhanced urban assets. And the result is that it lowers the costs of delivering essential services, and it protects homes better from extreme weather and reduces emissions. And the reason that's the case is because natural assets can offload engineered assets with lower cost and longer lifespan capabilities. And these are discussed by these organizations, all these organizations listed on the right. And the result is a better quality of life for the community because natural assets create a more resilient infrastructure. So 150 local governments across Canada and at least 35 in BC are active in natural asset management. And there were new CSA group standards, Standards Association standards about how to financially account for these assets. Those were released in 2023. And we can look at a couple of examples here in yellow, looking at the cost of a natural asset for stormwater and flood management versus the equivalent engineered asset. So Nanaimo has Buttertubs Marsh Wildlife Sanctuary, and it's reclaimed over 22 hectares between 1974 and 2024 to provide this area to the community. And it provides the equivalent of $4 to $8 million in engineered assets for stormwater and flood management. And it also attracts 75,000 visitors per year. So it adds to the downtown economy in Nanaimo. There's also West Vancouver. They looked at a 90-meter section of culvert that needed to be replaced. And daylighting it would have cost $327,000. A new culvert would have been about the same. And they looked at the co-benefits to the community and they decided it was better to daylight it than to build the new culvert. So we can do similar things around Greater Victoria. And how are natural assets valued, natural and urban assets valued? The values are based on avoided costs per hectare per year, like avoided property or environmental damage costs or avoided healthcare costs. And along the top in blue, you can see categories like wetlands, riparian areas, urban forests, and shrub and herbaceous cover. And the values that I put up here are from Saanich. So these are just examples, and it assumes 50 trees per urban hectare, which is about half a block. And the values are from Saanich, but I used number of hectares from Victoria, and I used some example services, ecosystem services that would be provided, like carbon sequestration, stormwater, biodiversity, pollination for food production, and air quality. And if we're assuming that in, these are just guesses, if we wanted to have 5% of the total area wetlands, 5% riparian areas, 40% urban forest, and 30% shrub and herbaceous cover, the totals of services per year are there. And then along the bottom, there's also from Saanich the ability to measure physical and mental health services per year. And they estimated it to be $14 to $52 million per year. So the result of all this is that there's visibility for a municipality to see what these services are valued at, so that they can plan for targets in OCPs or asset management plans, and be able to potentially require certain numbers or percentages of variables, like in terms of public health services. We could set targets for number of vulnerable neighborhoods meeting tree canopy targets, number of tons of pollutants removed by shrubs and trees, biodiversity services like number of new developments with wildlife and bird-friendly designs, number of wetlands protected hectares, stormwater services like percent reductions in impermeable surfaces on private property. So this includes both public and private property, not just municipally owned. And another aspect of providing input to cities and municipalities is OCPs. They're due in December 2025, so now is good timing to start providing that type of input, like the need for natural infrastructure to be planned at the start of every project together with built infrastructure. Because of the lack of public input that's permitted, the primary way that communities can set objectives for developments, housing developments and other types of developments, would be through things like form and character housing development permit areas. And these also fill the gaps in tree protection bylaws, because tree protection bylaws are outweighed by zoning bylaws. So if the zoning bylaw says you can have a certain amount of space taken up by building or other development, then the trees aren't always protected. With DPAs, because they're part of the Local Government Act, they carry more weight. And also communities can monitor whether those objectives are being met in the OCPs. So the OCPs moving forward will carry more weight and have more power than they did in the past. Well, at least in terms of the way people viewed OCPs, they used to be more of a visionary document, but now there's more attention paid to them as to setting objectives. And the DPAs, the development permit areas within the OCPs, can specify trees and nature-based solutions for objectives like lower energy and water use and lower greenhouse gas emissions, wildlife-friendly designs of buildings, and watershed or ecosystem goals. And ideally, there would be 40% natural and green space for all new developments. And some examples, Colwood, they have this chapter on built and natural infrastructure, which references their assets, engineered and natural assets that deliver specific services like sewer connections and rainwater management. So they describe objectives like water conservation, rainwater management, wastewater management, and reduced urban heating. And Colwood uses DPAs like forming character sustainability DPAs, environmental protection DPAs, and natural hazards DPAs. And these are all mapped out in the community as to which areas of housing different DPAs can be applied. And these are in the Colwood's maps. And the same goes for View Royal. It uses this mechanism as well. And View Royal quotes in the development permit area section of its OCP objectives that are allowed under the Local Government Act. You can see in the lower right, protection and natural environment, its ecosystems and biological diversity, and skipping down towards the bottom, establishment of objectives to promote energy conservation, water conservation, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And all that's related to nature-based solutions as well as technology solutions. And Saanich's OCP, most housing is covered by what's called a general DPA. And in their general DPA design guidelines, they discuss things like bird-friendly designs and general environmental objectives and the types of housing that they apply to. So that covers the presentation. And I wanted to finish with a quote from the Legend of Kamasung, and I'm not sure how accurate the quote is. It's in a Saanich document, but it's probably been translated 1,000 times. But the quote is, "The creator changed some of her people, Kamasung's people, into Gary Oaks. He transformed others into flowers like blue camas and lily, and bade the northwest wind warrior spirit not to deal too harshly with the land of Kamasung." So in general, our lives depend on nature in both urban and wilderness areas, and nature relies on us to have a voice. So thanks very much. And I'll stop
Thank
sharing.
you. Sorry, Patty, I was having trouble turning my audio on.
So hopefully I've stopped sharing. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm sorry, Patty, it's Scaly again. I keep muting myself. I'll ask the first question because it's on my mind. This felt really hopeful listening to you. And I'm wondering, do you feel hopeful? Are the decision makers receptive to this very well presented, clearly happening information?
Yes, I think it's good that the community is becoming more aware of these mechanisms to achieve our objectives. And so the more that we discuss these options and use the terminology with decision makers, the more that they'll, remember that this is important. This is an important issue to the community. And it has happened with other things. For example, zero carbon step code that allows for the electrification of new buildings, an accelerated timeline starting in September 2024. That was advocated, that a lot of different community groups advocated for that in order to reduce emissions. So that had an impact on councils and staff. And in the past, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about nature and ecosystem services because it probably is because people tend to think that it's always going to be there. But now with all development pressures and climate change and the biodiversity crisis, it's more important than ever to raise our voices about the needs for addressing these issues.
Thank you, Patty. There are a couple of comments coming into the chat. Anne mentions that trees in boulevards and private yards go unwatered during summer drought. Thinking about what could be a solution for that.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good point, and I've noticed that because on my street I saw a dogwood die after the heat
Geez.
dome, a huge dogwood. Yeah, after the heat dome of 2021, I think. And probably we need to have more communication, maybe from the local governments themselves and perhaps community associations and conservation groups to remind people to either get water bags or water their trees more often, because people never used to do it. And now it's becoming more critical. So definitely from both sides, from local governments and from community associations.
Good point.
And the other question, do the people drawing up the guidelines for trees, shrubs, and herbaceous planting recognize the importance of using native plants, as they will support insects and birds much more than the usual introduced plants? Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot to mention that the general guideline is 70% native vegetation. And people have been talking, for example, about sequoias, especially because of the Sequoia Centennial Square and, debates around that. And the fact is that sequoias, even though they're not native to Vancouver Island, they're endangered in California because of climate change and wildfires. So there's probably always going to be a need to adopt some other plants. And that's why the general recommendation is 70% native. And another thing that probably decision makers need to be reminded of is that ecosystems require more than just trees. The trees are extremely important for shade and for other ecosystem services, but without the associated shrubs and herbaceous planting and ground covers, you're not going to support all wildlife and the complete wildlife life cycle. And so that needs to be emphasized over and over again, because it's probably the thing that's the most forgotten in all the discussions.
Very good point. What can be next steps for the people listening?
If you belong to a community association, also Nature Victoria, if you're not comfortable with public participation, for example, at council meetings, please write more letters to local governments and provincial governments, and maybe suggest to all the organizations that you belong to that these topics about nature-based solutions need to be at the forefront, because the more that decision makers hear the same message, the more that they're going to take action.
Thank you, Patty. So one final encouragement. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask Patty? Oh, there's a request for a comment on the tension between space needed for natural ecosystems and the need for more housing.
And there's always a way to achieve both. And so we have to have some more options available. For example, if there's pressure to cover the entire lot with a development, then we need to have conversations about federal and provincial funds, and also options like climate resilience bonds that other cities have used. to potentially fund the maintenance of green infrastructure on that land, or other incentives like business incentives or tax incentives. So there are a lot of options that probably haven't been discussed enough, and we need to have those conversations more often. And I think that having the ability to just say, yes, we can have both, and we can change the siting and format and massing of a building to achieve both. Those types of conversations need to happen. It's related to green urbanism as well, where there are concepts about how the buildings have to fit the spaces between the landscapes, not the other way around.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you, Patty. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but thank you everyone who joined us tonight. This has been a very, very rich presentation, Patty. I'm so grateful to you for your time.
Thanks. Should I answer that last question?
Yes, if something's come in, I'm sorry I missed it.
Okay. So the last question is, would you say that larger setbacks and more space for ecology means we have to accept taller buildings and deliver the more units required? Yeah, this gets into even like there are complex conversations that need to happen about affordable housing as well. There are, for example, initiatives that the government has taken, like extra vacancy taxes to discourage investors from buying properties to hold without renting. There's the need for people to actually be able to live in the community without exorbitant rents or mortgages. So there definitely we need to talk about affordability and not building, like too many units or units that people won't live in long term. And so, that's something that the community has to talk about more often. And again, another message that we need to send and present more options like funding from the government for affordable housing, co-ops is an option, and that the community wants to have people living in these units, not just investing in these units, because 50% of the condos in Victoria, for example, shown by Statistics Canada, were owned by investors.
Thank you, Patty. I've just had a question regarding making this video available. So that was our agreement to do that. I will take care of that over the next couple of days. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. I guess it's time to say goodnight. Thank you again, Patty. Your time was much appreciated.
Thanks. Thanks to everybody.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.